Chapter 23. Festos. The stars in the east over the mountains were fading and the sky was an inky blue when Haille set out the next morning. Lorna walked him down to the bank of the Liam where two men of the manor waited with a rowboat. Lorna gave Haille a blessing. To which gods or spirits she mumbled he did not ask, but he felt an odd sensation as she laid her hands on his shoulders and his head. "We are a long way from the edicts of the Inquisitors here." She sent him off with a kiss to the forehead and guided him towards the waiting boat. The men took him across the swift waters in silence, the only noise that of the water lapping on the hull and the oars in the oarlocks. The opposite bank came quickly enough, as the Liam was not a wide river, more of a deep channel that cut between the arrowhead of land that was the Dredenharn and the rising sentinel hills of Festos. Haille thanked the men. Each nodded in turn, but kept their silence as if this transition from one bank to another was somehow a sacred ritual and words were too profane to be uttered. He crossed the towpath where donkeys would walk, pulling barges north against the current to Falum and the ungoverned northern territories. The hills began immediately, and instead of striking up the nearest slope, Haille took Lorna's advice, walking south until he came upon a stone post depicting the distance to Rivertown on one side and the leagues to Falum on the other. From there he turned into a gap between the hills where a disused path ran eastward. It was overgrown and springy with moss, but was easier to walk than where the hillsides were thick with heather. So he made his way under the morning stars. It did not take long for signs of the river, Rivertown, even the Rimkurs, to be eclipsed by the steep slopes rising all around him. They were not nearly as high as the mountain range to the east, but they were sharp and rose like the frozen waves of a storm at sea. Haille could see why they were referred to by some as the Lost Hills, since it was easy to become disoriented walking through their valleys and glens. Without trees or other landmarks, each looked like the one before it. A few times he clambered to the top of one of the hills just to check his bearings. His heart would pound in his chest from the climb, his breath coming hard, his legs soaked with the morning dew from the heather. The view was worth the climb. From the top he could see the Rimkurs rising in all their snowy coldness, the sun rays beginning to pass among their peaks, but its warmth no threat to their layers of ice. The Liam and Rivertown were already lost. He put his hand on the rucksack Lorna and Sorel had packed for him. It was a reminder of when he was surrounded by companions, and some hope that he would be with friends again at the end of this journey. Lorna had provided him with a trifold parchment map that he consulted throughout the day. It depicted the road he was on now, a snaking line threading among the foothills until it reached the rising wall of the Rimkurs. It was the route used by the diamond miners in the heyday of the Moorbright mine, and now that she had pointed it out to him, Haille could pick out the saw-tooth ridge that was Moorbright Mountain. It was neither the highest nor the lowest, but its height did not matter since he was not going to be climbing to its top. The mine was halfway up, just short of the snow line, according to his hostess. Lorna had said the mine itself had ceased to produce gemstones decades before. It faded from memory, became a mere curiosity, eventually more of a legend. After it was a place of fortune, it became a place of foul luck, collapses and cave-ins taking the lives of the occasional prospectors daring enough to brave its crumbling tunnels. For a moment, anxiety flared within him as he wondered what he would do if the entire mine had collapsed in the intervening years. To come so close and to be foiled would have been a sad fate, but he pushed such thoughts aside and focused on trudging along the grass-choked road, following the old wheel ruts with his feet, noting the occasional marker with leagues to the mine still carved on its face. The shade of evening came early in the glens between the marching hills. He ate his supper of bread, cheese, and smoked beef on a ridgetop, taking in the last rays of the day, looking back and reflecting on the lands he had crossed. Farmers' fields, swamps, forests, and now moors, all to arrive at this place where he did not even feel like himself anymore. He found a depression cut into the hill by heavy rains that was lined with dry rocks and sand. The banks to either side provided good windbreaks, so he settled himself between them to sleep that night. He felt safe, laying there, drifting off to sleep, the stars winking at him through the swaying grass blades. He woke before dawn. A frost settled on his clothes, his breath a smoking cloud about his head. The sky was still a dark indigo, but it was too cold to sleep any longer, Even curling into himself beneath his blanket offered him no relief, so he wrapped it up, stuffed it back into his rucksack, and started east once more, stamping his feet to drive off the cold. The sky lightened, turning the clouds among the mountain heads red, then rose, then fiery orange until mid-morning when they burned away completely and the sunlight warmed the air. Blue bonnets growing on the slopes of the hills opened and Haille stopped for breakfast. He spent much of the rest of the morning and most of the day feeling as if he had just heard a cry or a whinny from a horse. Multiple times he climbed up to the top of the nearest hill to survey his surroundings, but aside from the occasional hawk, he was alone. The ground was changing. The soil became rockier while the sheer granite face of the rimkurs and its brows crowned in snow fields were coming into focus. A few times when he stopped to fill his canteen from a stream or just to rest, he thought he felt the ground trembling. He knew earthquakes were not uncommon in the mountains, but these tremors were quick and fleeting, and he was never sure if they were the result of his own aching muscles twitching or something subterranean. It was not until the afternoon when he relaxed next to a stream that he became certain that the earth beneath him was shaking. The water was limpid and the surface clear and braided with the crisscross of rifles as it flowed over smooth stones. But an unmistakable tremor set the edges of the stream trembling in time with the vibrations Haille felt up through his body. As if to confirm his suspicions, a few rocks tumbled and clacked into one another before plunking into the water. With a hand pressed to the ground, he felt something familiar, a cadence he knew from parade ground and practice fields. He gathered up his belongings, stuffing his canteen into his rucksack and arms through the straps. Again he heard a horse's whinny. He was not alone. Out of instinct, he rushed for a boulder to hide himself, just as the first shape crested the ridge. One followed another, and soon an entire river of mounded muscle and flying manes coursed down the hillside. Stallions, mares, foals, unsaddled, shaggy, and wild. Not one bore a rider or saddle. Their coats instead were flecked with mud, their manes long and unkempt. Festos wilds. Haille had heard of the wild horses of the moors, but he had never imagined he would see them or be in their midst. They trampled the heather, the bushes shivering and shaking before disappearing completely under their hooves. They turned down the road like water flowing into a channel. Haille climbed up on the boulder just as they flowed around him, the air filled with their scent, sweet grassy breath, a hovering cloud of dust, and trampled heather. Their manes shone, and their eyes roved all over him, a strange and peculiar shape intruding on their territory of hills, heather, and wonder. The last of the herd passed. Haille followed their tracks around the next hill to find them spread out in a meadow of belly-high grass. Their momentum had dissipated, and now they grazed and played, foals nipping at each other and galloping in circles about their mothers. The mountains in their majesty, the golden medallion of the sun, the sea of hills were all upstaged by the moving, carousing show that was the wild herd. For an hour or so, Haille forgot the urgency of his own task. Instead, he simply sat, watching the horses in their element, envying them their eternal present. It was only when the shadows turned in the hills and stretched to the east that Haille was reminded of the passage of time and the quest he was on. The font and its promise of healing called him. He left the horses behind, staring up into the long path ahead of him, and felt lonelier than he had in days. It wasn't even as cold as it had been the other evenings, but when he came upon the fallen remnants of a dried and withered tree, he gathered bundles of grass, broke off what branches he could, and started a fire. Sleep did not come easily this night. His mind was restless, and in the flames he thought he could see the shapes of other pilgrims like himself, twisted with deformities, limping with palsy, or bent with sclerosis, pinning their hopes foolishly on a legend, on superstition and rumors of magic and healing. Eventually he slept, waking occasionally to add wood to the fire, but it became difficult to distinguish his lucid moments of wakefulness from dreams. For it seemed that in both he was tending the fire to keep the flames high and the shadows at bay, shadows that coalesced into faces, long faces of wandering, curious horses, searching faces of cripples and freaks like himself, and more familiar faces of accusation, starting with Garn, but replaced by Cody, Val, and Caitlin. He prayed that it was not their ghosts he saw, but just his own guilt manifest. He had been such a fool to leave them. Then again he welcomed his loneliness like a punishment he deserved, the exile he always expected. He woke to footsteps and voices. He startled up just as someone yanked him by his collar and dragged him across the ground, his legs kicking up sparks from the remnants of his fire. The man dragging him picked him up only to unsheathe Haille's dagger and pitch him forward face down into the grass. In the brief spell of falling, Haille glimpsed horses with riders and armed men to all sides. The sun was obscured behind clouds that covered the sky, but he sensed it was late morning. When he had finally slept, he had dropped into a deep sleep that had carried him past the dawn and left him exposed in the open to be found. He rolled over to take in familiar shapes and figures as if his dream had been a premonition. Vandales, the man with the mangled hands, sat astride his horse, his men mounted beside him except for Silas, who had dragged him up and now looked down in amusement at Haille's alarm. But it was the other figures that drew Haille's attention even more, his heart dilating in his chest. Tied in slaves' links to a horse, their mouths gagged, their eyes a mixture of pity and pleading, were his friends, Val, Cody, and Caitlin, the very friends he had sent away. Betrayed, he could see now. The road had been harshest on Caitlin. She had been forced to march in stockings that had grown torn and ragged and soiled with filth. Through the holes he could see her feet were blistered and bloodied. All three of them looked thinner as if their gags had not been removed to let them eat, their eyes wide and sunken in their faces. Even the elk, that had so miraculously defeated the riders previously, was captured and bound so that it could walk but not run, its mouth clamped in a metal muzzle as if it were a rabid dog. Haille did not try to get up. What dignity or defiance he still had he would not surrender by standing, only to let this brute Silas shove him down once more. Vandales crossed his arms over the pommel of his saddle and leaned forward. "Well, here we are," he said. Another man dismounted, picked up Haille's rucksack and upended it, shaking the contents onto the ground. His canteen, foodstuffs, and the map fell onto the grass. The man picked up the map and handed it to Vandales. He pinched its edges with the fingers he had left and unfolded it. "What do you want?" Haille asked. "The same thing you seek. The font." "It's a legend. Superstition at best. What do you want with it?" "Don't play me for a fool. You didn't come all this way for a legend," Vandale said, the blades on his wrists catching the sunlight as he adjusted his remaining fingers on the reins. "A magical fountain that heals cripples and freaks," Haille said in as dismissive a tone as he could muster. "That grants the wishes of children so born with deformities or ailments. Who said a child must be so selfish as to ask to be healed? No. We find the font, and you will wish for what I tell you to wish." "That's preposterous. How can you make me?" "I'll kill your